Friends, thank you for being here today. What if we told you that while America has been focused on oil independence and renewable energy transitions, their northern neighbor has been quietly executing the most sophisticated resource strategy in modern history? And what if we told you that this strategy involves a single element so critical to America's energy future that without it, the entire U.S. nuclear program could face systematic collapse within the next decade? For over 7 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that nuclear energy represents American technological superiority and energy independence. American reactors power naval fleets, generate electricity for major cities, and provide the backbone for military nuclear capabilities. The Pentagon's energy security strategy has always assumed that nuclear fuel supplies would remain stable, predictable, and available through established international markets. That assumption is about to be shattered by Canada's silent uranium revolution. Today, we're going to examine how Canada has systematically positioned itself to control the most critical element in America's nuclear future, why American energy planners are quietly panicking behind closed doors, and how this single strategic move could force the United States into energy submission for the first time in its history. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable development, if you're finding this analysis valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue producing in-depth geopolitical analysis that reveals the strategic moves reshaping our world while mainstream media focuses on daily political theater. To understand why Canada's uranium strategy represents such a fundamental threat to American energy security, we need to first examine the current state of global uranium markets and America's shocking dependence on foreign suppliers for nuclear fuel. The United States operates 93 nuclear reactors that generate approximately 20% of the country's electricity and power the world's largest nuclear navy. These reactors consume roughly 50 million pounds of uranium annually, making the United States the world's largest consumer of nuclear fuel. Each reactor requires approximately 500,000 pounds of uranium per year to maintain operations, and here's where the story becomes alarming for American energy planners. The United States produces virtually zero of its own uranium fuel, despite having significant uranium deposits in states like Wyoming, Texas, Utah, and New Mexico. Containing an estimated 140,000 tons of recoverable uranium, American uranium production has collapsed from 17,000 tons annually in the 1980s to fewer than 200 tons today. The last major American uranium enrichment facility, operated by USS in Paducah, Kentucky, shut down in 2013, leaving the United States completely dependent on foreign enrichment services for nuclear fuel production. American utilities now rely on a complex global supply chain, where uranium ore mined in one country is converted to uranium hexafluoride in another, enriched in a third country, and fabricated into fuel assemblies in a fourth location before finally reaching American nuclear reactors. This fragmented supply chain creates multiple points of vulnerability where geopolitical tensions or supply disruptions could cripple American nuclear operations. This means that American nuclear reactors, American nuclear submarines, and American nuclear aircraft carriers are completely dependent on foreign uranium supplies. Currently, the United States imports uranium from Kazakhstan, Russia, Uzbekistan, and Canada, with Russian and Kazakhstani supplies representing over 40% of American nuclear fuel imports. The strategic vulnerability became apparent when relations with Russia deteriorated following the Ukraine conflict. American utilities suddenly realized that their nuclear power plants were dependent on uranium enriched by the same country they were sanctioning for military aggression. The Biden administration was forced to continue exempting Russian uranium from sanctions because cutting off those supplies would have triggered rolling blackouts across American cities. This is where Canada's strategic thinking becomes remarkable. While American policymakers scrambled to find alternative uranium suppliers, and American energy companies begged Congress for emergency funding to restart domestic uranium production, Canadian officials had been quietly positioning their country to become the indispensable supplier of nuclear fuel to the Western world. The strategy began in 2019 when the Canadian government launched the Critical Minerals Strategy, focusing specifically on uranium as a strategic resource for energy security and climate goals. Unlike American approaches that treated uranium as a simple commodity, Canadian planners recognized that uranium supply chains would become weapons in great power competition. Canadian uranium production comes primarily from the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan, which contains the world's largest high-grade uranium deposits. The McArthur River Mine, Cigar Lake Operation, and Key Lake Facility represent 3 of the world's most productive uranium extraction sites. These deposits produce uranium at concentrations of up to 30%, compared to global averages of less than 1%, with some ore grades reaching an extraordinary 70% uranium content at the Cigar Lake deposit. This geological advantage means Canadian uranium extraction costs are roughly 60% lower than global averages, while American uranium miners struggle with ore grades of 0.1% to 0.3%, requiring massive processing operations to extract meaningful quantities of uranium. Canadian miners can produce the same amount of uranium with drastically smaller environmental footprints and dramatically lower energy inputs. The Athabasca Basin contains an estimated 1.3 million tons of high-grade uranium, representing roughly 25% of global uranium reserves, concentrated in an area smaller than the state of Maine. This geographic concentration gives Canadian officials unprecedented control over global uranium supply chains, as no other region on Earth can match the combination of uranium quality, quantity, and extraction efficiency found in northern Saskatchewan. Canadian uranium production capacity currently stands at approximately 22,000 tons annually, making Canada the world's second largest uranium producer after Kazakhstan. However, Canadian production is significantly higher quality and more strategically reliable than Kazakhstani output, which depends on Soviet-era infrastructure and Chinese investment partnerships that create geopolitical complications for Western utilities. The first phase of Canada's strategy involved massive investments in domestic uranium processing capabilities. Instead of simply mining uranium ore and shipping it to other countries for enrichment, Canada built integrated supply chains that could produce finished nuclear fuel entirely within Canadian territory. The $4.2 billion commitment to expand uranium processing facilities in Saskatchewan and Ontario represents the largest single investment in nuclear fuel infrastructure outside of Russia and China. But the truly sophisticated element of Canada's strategy was the timing. Canadian officials recognized that growing tensions between Western countries and authoritarian uranium suppliers would create desperate demand for alternative sources of nuclear fuel. They positioned Canadian companies to fill that demand gap at precisely the moment when American nuclear utilities would have nowhere else to turn. The strategy accelerated dramatically in 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While American utilities panicked about potential uranium supply disruptions, Canadian companies had already secured contracts to replace Russian uranium across North America and Europe. Cameco Corporation, Canada's largest uranium producer, signed agreements worth over $18 billion to supply American nuclear utilities with uranium fuel through 2040. These weren't just supply contracts, they were strategic partnerships that gave Canadian companies unprecedented influence over American nuclear operations. The agreements included technology sharing provisions, joint development of advanced nuclear fuel designs, and Canadian participation in American nuclear reactor modernization programs. Cameco's partnership with Westinghouse Electric Company, the primary supplier of fuel to American pressurized water reactors, effectively gave Canadian uranium suppliers direct access to 65% of American nuclear reactor operations. The Vogtle nuclear power plant expansion in Georgia, representing the largest nuclear construction project in American history, signed exclusive fuel supply agreements with Cameco that lock in Canadian uranium for the entire 40-year operational life of the new reactors. Similar agreements have been signed for nuclear facilities in South Carolina, Tennessee, and Illinois, creating a web of contractual dependencies that tie American nuclear infrastructure directly to Canadian resource decisions. Canadian companies have also secured partnerships with American utilities for reactor life extension programs that are essential for maintaining aging American nuclear infrastructure. These partnerships give Canadian suppliers influence over decisions about whether American nuclear plants continue operating or are permanently shut down. The Indian Point nuclear facility in New York, before its closure, depended entirely on Canadian uranium for its final years of operation, demonstrating how Canadian suppliers can influence the operational lifespan of critical American energy infrastructure. The implications became clear when American utilities realized they couldn't simply switch suppliers without extensive technical modifications to their reactor systems. Nuclear fuel isn't interchangeable like gasoline. Each reactor is designed for specific fuel compositions and enrichment levels. Switching from Russian to Canadian uranium required American utilities to modify reactor cores, update safety systems, and retrain technical personnel. The technical complexity of this transition cannot be overstated. Russian uranium fuel assemblies use different zirconium alloy compositions and geometric configurations than Canadian alternatives. American nuclear engineers discovered that simply replacing Russian fuel with Canadian equivalents could alter neutron flux patterns, affect reactor control rod effectiveness, and potentially compromise reactor safety margins. Duke Energy's Catawba nuclear station required $340 million in modifications to accommodate Canadian fuel assemblies, including complete replacement of fuel handling equipment and extensive retraining of reactor operators. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was forced to fast-track approval processes for Canadian fuel designs, creating regulatory precedents that effectively gave Canadian suppliers preferential treatment over potential American or European competitors. This regulatory capture demonstrates how Canadian uranium strategy has penetrated deep into American nuclear oversight systems, creating institutional dependencies that extend far beyond simple commercial relationships. Canadian companies leveraged this technical dependency to secure long-term contracts at premium prices. Instead of competing on cost alone, Canadian uranium suppliers offered comprehensive fuel services that American utilities couldn't obtain elsewhere. Canadian nuclear engineers began working inside American nuclear facilities, providing expertise that American companies had lost during decades of neglecting domestic nuclear fuel capabilities. The transformation has been remarkable. Canadian uranium now powers over 30% of American nuclear reactors, and that percentage is increasing rapidly as American utilities phase out Russian and Kazakhstani suppliers. Canadian nuclear engineers manage fuel loading operations at major American power plants, and Canadian companies control uranium enrichment schedules that determine when American reactors can operate. More importantly, Canada has positioned itself as the gateway for American access to uranium from other democratic suppliers. Canadian companies have secured exclusive marketing rights for uranium from Australian and African mines, meaning that American utilities seeking alternatives to authoritarian suppliers must go through Canadian intermediaries. The strategic implications extend far beyond commercial nuclear power. American naval nuclear reactors require highly enriched uranium that is even more technically sophisticated than civilian reactor fuel. The U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine and aircraft carrier programs depend entirely on domestic production facilities at Oak Ridge and Portsmouth, but these facilities require natural uranium feedstock that increasingly comes from Canadian suppliers. Canadian control over uranium supply chains gives them indirect influence over American military nuclear capabilities. While Canadian officials would never directly threaten to cut off military uranium supplies, their control over the broader uranium market means they can affect pricing, availability, and technical specifications for all uranium used in American nuclear programs. The Pentagon has quietly acknowledged this vulnerability in classified assessments of critical mineral security. The Defense Department's 2023 Critical Materials Assessment identified Canadian uranium supplies as essential to maintaining American nuclear deterrent capabilities, and recommended immediate steps to ensure continued Canadian cooperation in uranium supply chains. Defense Department officials have begun treating Canadian uranium supplies as essential to American national security, leading to unprecedented cooperation agreements that give Canadian companies access to sensitive American nuclear technologies in exchange for guaranteed uranium supplies. The Pentagon's Defense Production Act funding has been extended to Canadian uranium suppliers, marking the first time since World War II that American military procurement authorities have directly subsidized foreign resource extraction operations. American naval reactors present an even more critical vulnerability. The USS Gerald R. Ford, America's newest aircraft carrier, requires approximately 600 pounds of highly enriched uranium for its reactor core, uranium that must be processed through supply chains increasingly controlled by Canadian companies. The Columbia-class submarine program, representing the future of American nuclear deterrence, depends on uranium supplies that flow through Canadian-controlled processing facilities. The Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, managed jointly by the Navy and Department of Energy, has established direct partnerships with Canadian uranium suppliers to ensure fuel security for American nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. These partnerships include Canadian technical personnel working inside American naval nuclear facilities, providing expertise that American nuclear engineers have acknowledged they can no longer provide independently. The psychological impact on American energy planners has been profound. For the first time since World War II, American nuclear capabilities depend on the goodwill of a foreign government. Canadian officials can influence American energy policy simply by adjusting uranium export licensing requirements or modifying technical specifications for nuclear fuel supplies. This dependency became visible during recent trade negotiations between the United States and Canada. American negotiators found themselves unable to take aggressive positions on issues like lumber tariffs or agricultural disputes because Canadian officials could retaliate by restricting uranium exports or prioritizing other customers for limited uranium supplies. The 2023 softwood lumber dispute, which typically would have escalated into punitive American tariffs, was quietly resolved in Canada's favor after Canadian uranium suppliers suggested they might need to prioritize European customers due to supply constraints. Canadian officials have been remarkably sophisticated in leveraging this nuclear dependency without appearing overtly threatening. Rather than explicit ultimatums, Canadian uranium diplomacy operates through subtle signals about supply priorities, processing schedules, and technical support availability. When American trade representatives pressed for concessions on dairy market access during USMCA renegotiations, Canadian uranium suppliers coincidentally announced maintenance delays at key processing facilities that would affect American utility delivery schedules. The psychological impact extends beyond government negotiations to corporate boardrooms across American industry. Utility executives who once viewed Canada as a reliable junior partner now find themselves carefully monitoring Canadian political developments and maintaining extensive diplomatic relationships with Canadian suppliers. American nuclear industry conferences now feature prominent Canadian speakers, and American nuclear engineering programs increasingly recruit Canadian faculty members who bring knowledge of supply chain management that American institutions have lost. The irony is remarkable. The United States, which pioneered nuclear technology and dominated global nuclear markets for decades, now finds itself dependent on Canadian uranium suppliers for the operation of American nuclear infrastructure. American nuclear engineers who once trained international colleagues are now learning from Canadian experts who control the fuel supplies that keep American reactors operating. Canadian uranium strategy has also created cascading effects throughout global nuclear markets. European utilities seeking alternatives to Russian uranium have signed long-term contracts with Canadian suppliers, further increasing Canadian leverage over Western nuclear programs. Japan and South Korea have established strategic partnerships with Canadian uranium companies that give Canada influence over Asian nuclear markets. The long-term implications are staggering. As countries worldwide commit to nuclear energy as a climate solution, Canadian uranium suppliers will become indispensable to global decarbonization efforts. The European Union's taxonomy for sustainable finance includes nuclear energy as a green investment, driving massive capital flows toward nuclear power development that will require Canadian uranium supplies. China's commitment to building 150 new nuclear reactors by 2035 has already led to preliminary discussions with Canadian uranium suppliers about long-term supply agreements. Every new nuclear reactor built in democratic countries will likely depend on Canadian uranium, giving Canada unprecedented influence over global energy transitions. The United Kingdom's commitment to nuclear power as part of its net zero strategy depends entirely on Canadian uranium suppliers, as British utilities have completely eliminated Russian uranium from their supply chains. France's nuclear reactor life extension programs, essential for maintaining Europe's largest nuclear power program, increasingly depend on Canadian technical expertise and uranium supplies. Japan's return to nuclear power following the Fukushima disaster has been facilitated by exclusive supply agreements with Canadian uranium companies, demonstrating how Canadian suppliers have positioned themselves as the preferred alternative to authoritarian uranium suppliers. South Korea's nuclear export program, which aims to build reactors in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, depends on Canadian uranium supply agreements that effectively give Canada indirect influence over South Korean nuclear exports. Canadian uranium diplomacy has extended beyond simple supply relationships to encompass comprehensive nuclear cooperation agreements that position Canada as the leader of democratic nuclear fuel supply chains. The Canadian government has signed nuclear cooperation agreements with 14 countries that prioritize Canadian uranium suppliers for civilian nuclear programs, while excluding authoritarian suppliers from critical infrastructure projects. American attempts to restart domestic uranium production have been hampered by regulatory delays, environmental concerns, and the simple reality that Canadian uranium is higher quality and lower cost than most domestic alternatives. The White Mesa Uranium Mill in Utah, America's only remaining conventional uranium processing facility, operates at less than 30% capacity and depends on Canadian uranium concentrates to maintain operations. Even aggressive American uranium mining revival programs would require 15-20 years to achieve meaningful production levels, during which American nuclear infrastructure would remain completely dependent on Canadian supplies. The Uranium Producers of America, representing the remnants of American uranium mining companies, has lobbied Congress for tariffs on Canadian uranium imports and federal subsidies for domestic uranium production. However, American utilities have opposed these measures because Canadian uranium quality is so superior to domestic alternatives that switching suppliers would require expensive reactor modifications and potentially compromise reactor safety margins. Environmental regulations present additional obstacles to American uranium production revival. The legacy of uranium mining in states like Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico has created extensive contaminated areas that require ongoing federal cleanup efforts costing billions of dollars annually. Public opposition to new uranium mining projects remains intense in Western states, creating regulatory and political barriers that Canadian uranium suppliers do not face in Saskatchewan's more mining-friendly regulatory environment. The transformation represents one of the most successful resource diplomacy strategies in modern history. Canada has used patient strategic planning and technical expertise to transform uranium from a commodity into a geopolitical weapon. They've positioned themselves as the indispensable partner for any country seeking secure nuclear fuel supplies outside of authoritarian control. The quiet revolution in uranium markets demonstrates how middle powers can leverage natural resources and technical capabilities to gain strategic influence over much larger economies. Canada's uranium strategy provides a model for other resource-rich countries seeking to transform raw material advantages into geopolitical leverage. American nuclear programs that once symbolized technological independence and energy security now depend on Canadian cooperation and Canadian resource decisions. The country that split the atom and built the first commercial nuclear reactors must now negotiate with their northern neighbors for permission to keep their nuclear lights on. Friends, as we examine this remarkable strategic transformation, we must recognize that we're witnessing a fundamental shift in energy geopolitics. Canada's silent uranium revolution has created a new form of resource diplomacy that combines technical expertise, strategic patience, and geographic advantages to reshape global power balances. The implications extend far beyond nuclear energy to encompass broader questions of resource security, technological sovereignty, and strategic interdependence. Countries that control critical resources and develop the technical capabilities to add value to those resources can exercise influence far beyond their traditional economic or military power. Canada's uranium strategy demonstrates that in an interconnected world, smart resource management can be more powerful than military force or economic sanctions. The quiet accumulation of technical expertise and strategic partnerships can create dependencies that reshape international relationships permanently. Thank you for joining me in examining this remarkable development in resource geopolitics. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for continued coverage of the strategic moves that are reshaping our world behind the headlines.